Linguistic prescription is the practice of elevating one variety or manner of language use over another. It may imply some forms are incorrect, improper, illogical, lack communicative effect, or are of low aesthetic value. Sometimes informed by linguistic purism, these normative practices may address such linguistics aspects as spelling, grammar, semantics, pronunciation, and syntax. They may also include judgments on socially proper and politically correct language use. Linguistic prescriptivism may aim to establish a standard language, teach what a particular society perceives as a correct form, or advise on effective communication. If usage preferences are conservative, prescription might appear resistant to language change. If radical, it may produce neologisms. Prescriptive approaches to language are often contrasted with descriptive linguistics, which observes and records how language actually is used. The basis of linguistic research is text analysis and field study, both of which are descriptive activities. Description, however, may include researchers' observations of their own language usage. Despite being apparent opposites, prescription and description may inform each other, as comprehensive descriptive accounts must take speaker preferences into account, and an understanding of how language is actually used is necessary for prescription to be effective. Aims. The chief aim of linguistic prescription is to specify standard language forms in a way that is easily taught and learned. Prescription may apply to most aspects of language, including spelling, grammar, semantics, pronunciation, syntax, and register. Standardized languages are useful for interregional communication, allowing speakers of divergent dialects to understand a standard language used in broadcasting, for example, more readily than each other's dialects. While such a lingua franca may evolve by itself, the desire to formulate and define it is widespread in most parts of the world. Writers or communicators often adhere to prescriptive rules to make the communication clearer and more widely understood. Linguistic prescription may also be used to impose a political ideology. During the second half of the 20th century, politically motivated efforts driven by various advocacy groups had considerable influence on language use under the broad banner of political correctness. These successfully imposed special rules for anti-sexist, anti-racist or generically anti-discriminatory language. George Orwell criticized the use of euphemisms and convoluted phrasing as a means of hiding insincerity in politics and the English language. His fictional Newspeak is a parody of ideologically motivated linguistic prescriptivism. Authority. Prescription presupposes an authority whose judgment may be followed by other members of a speech community. This may be a prominent writer or educator such as Henry Fowler, whose modern English usage defined the standard for British English for much of the 20th century, or Strunk and White in their elements of style for American English. The Duden grammar has a similar status for German, although lexicographers often see the work as purely descriptive. Dictionaries are widely regarded as prescriptive authorities by the community at large. Popular books such as Lynn Truss's Eats, Shoots and Amp Leaves, which argues for stricter adherence to prescriptive punctuation rules, also seek to exert an influence. Linguistic prescription is regulated formally in some language communities. The Académie Française in Paris is a French national body whose recommendations are widely respected though not legally enforceable there. In Germany and the Netherlands, recent spelling reforms were devised by teams of linguists commissioned by the government, then implemented by statute. Some were met with significant political dissent, as was the German orthography reform of 1996. Other kinds of authorities exist in specific settings, such as publishers establishing a house style specifying preferred spellings or grammatical forms, such as serial commas. Wikipedia's own Wikipedia Manual of Style is an example of this. Others may be self-appointed advocates whose rules are propagated in the popular press as improper Cantonese pronunciation. Examples of national prescriptive bodies and initiatives include the Académie Française, the national language governing academic body whose recommendations, though legally unenforceable, are respected for maintaining standard French. The Accademia della Crusca, the Italian language academic body. The Office QUE Acute BE Acute COIs de la langue française in the Canadian province of Quebec, where French is perceived to be particularly threatened by the incursion of English. The German orthography reform of 1996 for German-speaking Germany, Austria, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, which established statutory national normative spelling usages for each. It has remained so controversial in Schleswig-Holstein that the vast majority of voters in a 1998 plebiscite opposed its execution in the federal state. However, its parliament overruled the decision in 1999. Many major German newspapers chose to only partially implement the reform or reject it entirely, ending a period where unified German spelling, although officially only mandatory in government and educational use, was the national de facto standard. In the Netherlands, standardized spelling norms were compulsory for Dutch government publications, yet popular and mass communications media language applied an adapted spelling reform. See word list of the Dutch language and the White Booklet. The Union of Soviet Writers policed the Russian language with prescriptive linguistics to establish a standardized Russian language during the era of the Soviet Union. The Real Academia Española, in affiliation with the Association of Spanish Language Academies for Standard Spanish in 21 countries. The Social Sciences and Albanological section of the Academy of Sciences of Albania for the Tosk variety of the Albanian Standard Language. The Romanian Academy for Standard Romanian, whose resolutions and recommendations are acknowledged by the Romanian state and other entities where Romanian is officially recognized. In the Republic of Moldova, the only country besides Romania where Romanian is the state language, it is officially called Moldovan and regulated by the Institute of Linguistics of Academy of Sciences of Moldova. Origins. Historically, linguistic prescriptivism originates in a standard language when a society establishes social stratification and a socio-economic hierarchy. The spoken and written language usages of the authorities are preserved as the standard language to emulate for social success. To distinguish itself from contemporary colloquial language, standard language usage includes archaisms and honorific colors. Likewise, the style of language used in ritual also differs from quotidian speech. Special ceremonial languages known only to a select few spiritual leaders within a community are found throughout the world. When a culture develops a writing system, orthographic rules for the consistent transcription of linguistic outputs allows for a large number of speakers to understand written communications with minimal difficulty. Linguists largely disregard native writing systems, replacing the conventional symbols of the language they are researching with phonetic transcriptions, but they nonetheless rely on some shared orthographic representation to preserve semantic identities with datasets. This is most commonly achieved by providing the conventional orthographic representation of the English translation of a word alongside the IPA transcription of the word's pronunciation when spoken by a native speaker. Early historical trends in literacy and alphabetization were closely tied to the influence of various religious institutions. Western Christianity propagated the Latin alphabet. Eastern Orthodoxy spread the Greek and Cyrillic alphabets. Judaism used the Hebrew alphabet and Islam the Arabic alphabet. Hinduism used the Devanagari script. In certain traditions, strict adherence to prescribed spellings and pronunciations was and remains of great spiritual importance. Islamic naming conventions and greetings are notable examples of linguistic prescription being prerequisite to spiritual righteousness. Another commonly cited example of prescriptive language usage closely associated with social propriety is the system of Japanese honorifics. Government bureaucracy tends toward prescriptivism as a means of enforcing functional continuity. Such prescriptivism dates from ancient Egypt, where bureaucrats preserved the spelling of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt into the Ptolemaic period through the standard usage of Egyptian hieroglyphics. Most, if not all, widely spoken languages demonstrate some degree of social codification in how they conform to prescriptive rules. Linguistic prestige is a central research topic within sociolinguistics. Notions of linguistic prestige apply to different dialects of the same language and also to separate, distinct languages in multilingual regions. Prestige level disparity often leads to diglossia, wherein speakers in certain social contexts consciously choose a prestige language or dialect over a lower, even if it is the native tongue. Problems. Although the standardization of language has an established place in such fields as broadcasting, computer programming, and international commerce, prescriptivism is often subject to criticism. Many linguists, such as Jeffrey Pullum and other posters to Language Log, are highly skeptical of the quality of advice given in many usage guides, including highly regarded books like Strunk and White's Elements of Style. In particular, linguists point out that popular books on English usage written by journalists and novelists often make basic errors in linguistic analysis. One problem is that prescription has a tendency to favor the language of one particular region or social class over others, and thus militates against linguistic diversity. Frequently, a standard dialect is associated with the upper class. For example, Great Britain's received pronunciation, RP, has now lost much of its status as the Anglophone standard, and General American and other standards are now alternative systems for English as a foreign language. Although these have a more democratic base, they are still standards that exclude large parts of the English-speaking world. Speakers of Scottish English, Hiberno English, Australian English, or African American Vernacular English may feel the standard is slanted against them. Thus, prescription has political consequences. In the past, prescription was used consciously as a political tool. A second problem with prescription is that prescriptive rules quickly become entrenched and it is difficult to change them when the language changes. Thus, there is a tendency for prescription to be excessively conservative. In 1834, an anonymous writer advised against the split infinitive, reasoning that the construction was not a frequent feature of English as he knew it. The construction is common today in most varieties of English, and a prohibition is not supported by observation. The rule nevertheless endured long after such a justification for it had disappeared. A further problem is the difficulty of specifying legitimate criteria. Although prescribing authorities almost invariably have clear ideas about why they make a particular choice, and their choices are therefore seldom entirely arbitrary, they often appear arbitrary to others who do not understand or are not sympathetic to the goals of the authorities. Judgments that seek to resolve ambiguity or increase the ability of the language to make subtle distinctions are easier to defend. Judgments based on the subjective associations of a word are more problematic. Finally, there is the problem of inappropriate dogmatism. Although competent authorities tend to make careful statements, popular pronouncements on language are apt to condemn. Thus, wise prescriptive advice may identify a form as non-standard and suggest that it be used with caution in some contexts. Repeated in the schoolroom, this may become a ruling that the non-standard form is automatically wrong, a view linguists reject. A classic example from 18th-century England is Robert Loth's tentative suggestion that preposition stranding in relative clauses sounds colloquial. For this grow a grammatical dogma that a sentence should never end with a preposition. For these reasons, some writers argue that linguistic prescription is foolish or futile. Samuel Johnson commented on the tendency of some prescription to resist language change. When we see men grow old and die at a certain time one after another, from century to century, we laugh at the elixir that promises to prolong life to 1,000 years, and with equal justice may the lexicographer be derided, who being able to produce no example of a nation that has preserved the words and phrases from mutability, shall imagine that his dictionary can embalm his language, and secure it from corruption and decay, that it is in his power to change sublunary nature, and clear the world at once from folly, vanity, and affectation. With this hope, however, academies have been instituted, to guard the avenue so the languages, to retain fugitives, and repulse intruders, but the vigilance and activity have hitherto been vain. Sounds are too volatile and subtle for legal restraints, to enchain syllables, and to lash the wind, are equally the undertakings of pride, unwilling to measure its desires by its strength. The French language has visibly changed under the inspection of the Academy. The style of Amelot's translation of Father Paul is observed by Le Curé to be un peu passé, and no Italian will maintain that the diction of any modern writer is not perceptibly different from that of Bocchus, Machiavel, or Caro.